All right, I'll call this special board meeting on the superintendent search to order. First item on the agenda is the approval of bids for Woodvale Elementary Classroom Wing Addition. I would entertain a motion. We have a motion by Mr. Angel and a second by Mr. Latchley that the board authorize staff to award the low base bid and alternate number 1 to Rudick Company Incorporated for $4,733,600 for the Woodvale Elementary Classroom Wing Addition in accordance with Louisiana Public Bid Law. Do we have any public comment on this item? Do we have any board member comment? Madam Secretary, I'll call for the vote. I sure did.
Nine, for, and against.
The next item on the agenda is going to be discussion with regard to the superintendent search procedure. So the way we're going to handle this now is anybody who wants to give their input is welcome to come to the podium and form a line if you have something to contribute to the conversation. We're going to open the floor to board members, but first we're going to, Mr. Hammonds and I will kind of outline the situation as we see it. So the superintendent retired at the conclusion of his contract at midnight on May 17th. At that point in time, we will not have a superintendent. So we have to decide this evening whether we would like to appoint an interim superintendent or perform a search where we accept traditional applications, whittle down the applicants to a certain few, interview those few, and then select a superintendent subsequent to a successful negotiation. And Mr. Hammonds, please correct me if I say anything wrong here. I'm going to recount our conversation from about a month ago. A couple of the constraints that we face as a board are due to the fact that this board has a 5-year term this time only. So when we hired Dr. Aguilar, we were unable to extend an offer that exceeded 4 years in length because state law prevents a school board from awarding more than a 4-year contract. Also, state law prevents from a board extending a contract that extends more than 2 years past the end of its term. So should we do a search right now, this spring, we would not be able to offer longer than a 2.5-year contract, essentially December 2021. We would be able to appoint an interim and extend the contract for a year, should we choose to go that route. Trying to think if there are any other circumstances that I'm missing in this case. So with that kind of discussion framework there, the board members have any comments they'd like to make. This item is information only, and so we will have an opportunity to comment on any motions made when we get to the next agenda item. But does anyone have any comments to make that would just kind of guide the I think what the board would like to have is hear any feedback so that when we get to the action item next, we might make a better motion that takes into account people's opinions. So with that, I'll open the floor to anyone who would like to contribute to the conversation. Mr. Hidalgo.
I have a question for Mr. Hammonds. Mr. Hammonds, if I understand correctly, you've been part in the past of superintendent searches, whether or not it's from the legal side or whether or not it's from the trenches. Is that correct? 100 of them. Wow. My question to you is, in your experience and in your opinion, when you go out to do a superintendent search in a situation like we're in here where we're not able to offer a 3 or a 4-year contract, when you're going out to search for a superintendent, whether it's right at home or statewide or nationally, and you're looking at a 1 or a 2-year opportunity, Do you typically get a huge level of interest from that type of a search, knowing that, the person who would apply would not get more than in this case, let's say 2 year and 6 months if we did it quickly, contract?
Mr. Hidalgo, it's been my experience, I don't know if either one of these work.
Would you please, just see if the button lights up? I don't know.
I'm not much on technology, so school teachers don't usually use them.
Dead. Mr. Hidalgo really wants you to answer his question.
Mr. Hidalgo's never met a microphone.
All right, does this help any?
That is infinitely better.
All right. Mr. Hidalgo, I was going to answer your question this way. It's been my experience that if you have primarily local candidates, the difference between a 2-year contract and a 4-year contract usually doesn't make a lot of difference. Where you find a difference is that if you're trying to attract people from outside of the system or from outside of the state, those types of individuals usually are reluctant to move their families into a new situation for a contract of 2 or 2.5 years. So again, if you want to go with a national search, for example, and look outside of the area or outside of the state, a 2 or 2.5 year contract is going to hurt you. But again, if you have primarily local candidates, it usually doesn't make that much of a difference.
Dr. Chessel.
Mr. Hammons, if you wouldn't mind, maybe run us through both scenarios. What's required of interim versus, I guess with me and Mr. Angel being on the board for so long, I know with permanent, it's 2 locals, 1 national advertisement, can't do it 30 days till after a certain point. Just if you could run us through interim first and then permanent, what's required?
Well, for interim, there's not really anything required. You won't find any statute anywhere that references the term interim superintendent.
Okay.
The only thing that I would recommend is that if you choose to go the interim route, that you make sure that the person selected is someone who would be qualified to serve as a superintendent. And that keeps you out of trouble with BSEE or with State Department of Education. They do have regulations, policies that establish the minimum requirements to be a superintendent. So if you have an interim who meets those qualifications, then you satisfy the requirements of BSEE, and I think that you would be in good stead. There is no requirement for any type of advertising. There is no requirement for any type of process for determining who would be named the interim, as opposed to that of the permanent superintendent. With regard to selection of your permanent superintendent, there really are only 2 or 3 requirements. Number 1 is that you have to advertise twice in your local journal, at least a week apart. You also have to advertise at least once in a large newspaper of over 100,000. That's your advertising requirements. Now, whether the board chooses to advertise at other places, other newspapers, other cities, on the web, or any place else, that's the board's prerogative to choose where you want to advertise. But legally, you're only required to run those 3 ads. The second requirement is that you cannot make your selection of a superintendent until at least 30 days after the date of the last advertisement. So whatever dates you run your ads, you have to wait at least 30 days after the last ad before you can make your selection. Now, that doesn't mean you can't be interviewing, that you can't be culling particular applicants or checking backgrounds and doing all the rest of it. You just can't make your selection for at least 30 days. And then after that, you're required by law to have a written contract with your superintendent. There are only a handful of employees of the school system who are required by law to have written contracts, and the superintendent is one of them. So at the end of the game, when you come to select your superintendent, you're going to want to make that selection subject to successful contract negotiation, because then you have to sit down and try to negotiate a written agreement with your superintendent. And by law, that agreement has to contain certain things depending on how well your schools are doing or not doing. And in your situation, because your schools do so well here, the contract would be relatively simple. But again, that's the 3rd step in the process. Beyond that, the process itself is left primarily to the boards for them to determine how you choose to go about your business. Again, the difference is that with regard to the permanent superintendent, you have to go through those 3 steps that I mentioned. With regard to an interim, you are not required to go through any of those steps, even though we would suggest the possibility of a contract with an interim if that's going to be for, say, a year or something like that, just to make sure that there is agreement as to, in principle, the compensation to be paid to the individual while they serve in the position of interim. So again, those would be my preliminary thoughts, Dr. Chison, and I don't know if I answered your question directly, but if not, I'll be happy to try again.
Yes, sir, you did. Would anyone happen to know if we still have a blind P.O. box? A P.O. box that can only be opened up until that point where we select, where we're pulling, no one can basically see the actual applications come in?
I would imagine that if it came to it, we could cough up the $100 to get a PO box for.
Okay. Would you
For a couple of
suggest a
months.
blind P.O. box as well?
Well, absolutely. Once you get into the permanent superintendent selection process, there are a number of recommendations that I would make, and that's one of them, is that I have found to be very successful in getting the maximum number of applicants if you have the responses to what we call a blind P.O. box. And I just mean that the only person that would have a key to that P.O. box would be the president of the board. And the P.O. box, all applications would go to that P.O. box, but that P.O. box would not be opened until after the deadline for applications had passed. And the reason that you do that is that I have found historically that if you review the applications as they come in, they become public records when you receive them, and you can, in essence, scare off potential candidates if they know that other people have applied. If you want to maximize your pool of potential applicants, you can do it to a blind P.O. box, open them all simultaneously, make them available to the public, the media at that time, and move forward. So that's a procedure that I have recommended in the last couple of dozen searches, and it's worked very effectively.
Do any members of the audience have any questions about anything that's been said thus far? Did you raise your hand? Oh, I was hoping you were raising your hand, that we would get a question. Yeah, I was talking to you with the head. Mr. Angel.
Thank you, Mr. President. I would like to offer my opinion, which is just that. I don't think that that we should impose upon the next board a superintendent. I would like to see the next board be in a position that this board was in, and that is to choose the superintendent for the vast majority of the duration of their term. I would like to see us appoint an interim superintendent for 1 year, from May, of course, from May to May, so it would be from May of 19 to May of 20. And then when the new board comes on in January of 2020, that board would begin a search for a superintendent, a permanent superintendent, which would I would envision would be seated perhaps in April, where that superintendent could work for a month with the interim superintendent, and then take over May 17th or whatever that magic day is. I feel strongly like we did. I feel that we should afford the next board as much authority as possible to assume to choose a superintendent. Some of us may be on that board, some of us may not. As it turned out, like Dr. Chaplin said, there were only 2 of us on the last board, is on this board. So I don't think we should spend a ton of money looking for a interim superintendent. I think we could choose one from among our ranks, and then a real honest to goodness, relatively expensive search could be done by the next board, beginning after they take office sometime in January. So I would hope that majority of us would agree that we should choose an interim superintendent for 1 year, And then let the new board advertise and pick a superintendent. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Angel. Mr. Latchley.
I wholeheartedly agree with Mr. Angel, and I know as a new board member coming in back in 2015 and watching what the old board was going through with the firing of a superintendent and naming an interim, and we were placed with a very good interim that I think could have gone on to be the superintendent if he would have chosen. And I appreciated the way they did that for us and allowed us to pick the superintendent that we would work with. I do plan on running for re-election. I do plan on sitting on the next board. But that's not solely up to me. That's the voters of District 5. And I personally would not feel comfortable strapping the next board with a superintendent that they have to work with for 2 years, and it may not be the person they would have chosen. And I'm not saying we'd pick a bad one or we'd pick a good one. I don't think it's our choice tonight or next week to choose the superintendent that will spend the majority of their time with the next board. So I'm definitely for the interim. I believe we can find someone within this system. It may be a dress rehearsal. It may be interim and done. That we don't know yet, but I would definitely agree with Mr. Angel.
Thank you, Mr. Latchley. Mr. Hammonds, are we restricted to, if we chose to go the interim route, are we restricted to choosing solely from our existing employees?
Mr. Santana, the answer to your question is no. And I can give you a close example. Iberville Parish went through a search just 2 years ago, and while they were searching, they hired the retired superintendent from Point Capee Parish to come in and serve as their interim superintendent for approximately 3 months while that search was underway. And since she had many years of experience as a superintendent, she was able to step into that position and handle the interim role very effectively. Now, quite honestly, one of the reasons the board did that is because they knew that they were going to go out quickly for their selection, and they didn't want to give anybody a leg up on the position. And so they made a decision, a conscious decision that the board made, that the interim would not be eligible to be a candidate for the permanent position. So in order to make it as completely objective and fair as they could. So for that reason, they went outside to bring in their interim, and that's completely within the rights of the board to do.
I have another question. Are we legally allowed to ask our HR department to produce a list of current employees with superintendent certification?
Yes, that's public record.
Okay. Mr. Latchley asked if the interim has to be certified. Mr. Hammonds, I don't think you said that they have to be, but it is quality practice to make sure.
Absolutely. It is far preferable to have them qualified or
to
certified.
not give the Department of Education a reason to. Mr. Butler.
So we were wondering if we did go with an interim, would they be merely appointed, or would they go through the same hiring process as a actual full-time superintendent?
The answer is merely appointed.
Can we change that?
We can do, sounds like anything we want, and if we go the interim route. It sounds like it's completely up to the board.
Was that something that the board would be open to? I mean, it sounds like most of you don't want to saddle the next
What is your alternative suggestion to simply appointing?
Well, to have an interview process, to let, even if they are coming from inside, let's sit them down, let's put them to the test, let's ask the questions that we want to ask, and let's get some information.
It's a very reasonable suggestion. Thank you. Mr. Knezik?
I have the great thing about being on the board is you can disagree with your buddies on the board and go have a glass of wine afterwards and then, enjoy the camaraderie and friendship. So with all due respect to Mr. Latchley and Mr. Angel, my opinion's different. My opinion's along the lines of, I feel like every ship needs a captain, right? I feel like we as a board have a commitment to appoint the future instructional leader, regardless of where it falls in our term. I feel like if we don't appoint or hire the next instructional leader, then what we've basically created is a leadership vacuum. We've created this period of time where nobody's really in charge. Nobody's really in charge. Sorry, my computer rebooted. Nobody's making the tough decisions. Nobody's really, I guess everybody's just kind of holding their breath, waiting to see what's going to happen next. And I just feel like, and again, I may not be right, I could be totally wrong, but I feel like if we avoid making this decision now, that we're going to create a leadership vacuum. We're going to cause, when it comes to personnel matters, I think that principal appointments, principals that may be considering a move may be hesitant to, people might be hesitant to apply for different jobs. So my recommendation when we get to it's going to be that we go through that process. We do have a lot of experience, and I would venture to say that we have more experience than a new board in making a decision on what type of person we want the school system, not the board, but the school system to serve with. We have 4.5 almost years of experience with working with superintendents. So we know the traits that we're looking for. We know the traits that will make a strong superintendent, that will be, regardless of a board, I know all of us feel like we act as one. And then future board will act as one. So, again, I'm just going to reiterate, I believe that avoiding the decision to go through that process now creates a leadership vacuum. I'm going to recommend, at least when we come to it, to go through that process, hire a superintendent for the maximum allowable contract term, which sounds like to be 2.5 years, because I think that person is going to be more likely to make the tough decisions necessary to lead the school system where it needs to be led, regardless of who this board is. Thank you.
Can you get her first? Or you want to go? Mr. Hidalgo.
Thank you. I agree with certainly one of the things Mr. Knezik said, in that it is the board's responsibility to appoint a superintendent, to hire a superintendent. And it's very important because, in fact, it's one of the most important things that we do on behalf of the people who put us where we are as a board. I know that when a principal is hired, et cetera, there are a lot of times where staff comes in and they have input, and all of the situations, all of the instances that I'm privy to, where staff came in a large group and gave input, especially if it was overwhelmingly on one way or the other, it's been a successful transition. It was a successful move for the school. So I don't think we should just have the board and staff involved. I think we need to get the public engaged. I have no problem with that. My main concern, to my knowledge, we have private money being offered to pay for a superintendent search, and that's great. I think that's great. I think we should take it. But again, just like Mr. Angel said, it's not the right thing to do for me, knowing that I will not be sitting in this seat next year representing all of the people of District 9, to make a decision that the next board member who is going to be sitting in this seat representing the folks of District 9 is going to have to live with not having the opportunity to make that decision on behalf of the people that voted him or her in. I hear what Mr. Knezik's saying about a leadership vacuum, and I would typically agree with that. However, in this case, I think it could quite possibly be the opposite. I think if we put an interim in place for whatever term that is, who could not apply to be the next superintendent, then we could quite possibly have someone who has zero concern about whatever political antics might hold him or her back from making the quote tough decision. So I think it could be opposite. I think it's a good thing to have an interim, a good interim, one that's been vetted, to come in, and whether or not that's 6 or 8 months, and then hey, we'll take the private money being offered. A superintendent search can start January 2nd, 2020, and it can end as quickly as legally possible with the new board making the decision. So, I guess certainly both sides of this argument have merit, but I certainly am in favor of an interim.
Thank you, Mr. Hidalgo. Ms. Arsenal?
Okay, yes, for our opinion. I have to agree with Mr. Knezik. A board is up there to make the hard decisions. Y'all point that out to us quite often. So it seems that if you're going to hire a competent superintendent whose vision aligns with the school system's vision, which is the 2020 plan, which seems to be working, and you're going to have school board members that we elect that share the same vision, it could work. Why do you want to go through this process twice if you could hire the right person the first time? So I do agree with you, Mr. Knezik.
Mr. Broussard?
I'd like to commend this board for the decision they've made for the last 4 years in thinking that we'll make the right decision going forward. I think hiring an interim, and if that interim is interested in becoming a superintendent, I think it would hamper their decisions on our decision to put that person in place. They would, whoever we hire. But I think that we can make the right decision to start a search now, if we so desire to do so, to hire someone permanent, and knowing that we'll make the right decision as to who our next leader would be, to work with the next 9 people, board members that are sitting on this, to move this forward in a manner that we're moving forward now. So I would support what Mr. Knizik has said, is that we start the process of hiring a superintendent instead of having an interim set in, and then the decision cannot be made on a permanent basis because we're somewhat walking on eggshells.
Ms. Morris?
I can see the pros and cons of both interim and beginning a search now. But I'm leaning much more strongly in favor of beginning the search at this point. I do understand that with an interim, especially bridging over an election year with new board members coming in, may feel hesitant to make some strong or tough decisions. So I think by hiring a new superintendent and doing the search now and giving them the contract that we're able to give under the statutory law will allow that new superintendent to act with the full authority of all superintendents and not feel hesitant to take some actions that may be tough if they don't feel like they have that full army behind them, I guess. So I'm in agreement with Mr. Knezik and Mr. Broussard and Ms. Arsenal back there.
Ms. Morrison and I are going to keep you guys in suspense as to what we want to do. Dr. Chasson.
All right, my turn. So that's 4 people, so I'll make 5. You're the 5th vote, Ms. Arsenal. So in 2010, there was a current superintendent whenever I got elected, and then he continued on. In 2015, whenever we got elected, there was an interim, and then we ended up appointing. So that's 2 exact scenarios that in 2010, someone was there. Everything was still fine. 2015, there was an interim. What I do recall is that even in both situations, the requirements of a permanent selection, it doesn't matter when you spend the money, we still have to spend the money because we're mandated to spend the money for an ad. Whether we get it privately donated or not, we still have to spend it no matter what. So I don't want anyone to think, oh, well, you guys are just choosing to spend the money. No matter what, we're going to either spend it now or a year from now. Something that was said earlier was someone said they didn't want to impose on the new board a permanent superintendent. But that's adults. that we're talking about imposing something on. What I don't want to impose upon the kids is an interim. And everyone here can agree that the most important thing in this entire situation is the kids. By imposing on the kids an interim, now I'm going to toss the term lame duck out there, but I need everybody to understand it. Not every person in an interim position ends up being a lame duck, but the odds of it occurring end up increasing because key district personnel that maybe are here or maybe abroad, they don't come work for an interim because you may not be here next year. So even though you're a superstar principal and we would like you to come work for us, I'm not coming. I need to know what the future direction is long-term. Changes that need to be made, they aren't made. Curriculum that needs to be implemented isn't. And I think I've said this to a couple of people on the board. Every lost day at Alice Boucher and J.W. Falk is worth 100 days. Every single lost day. The days that someone is scared to make the true decisions we need to keep things rolling at those schools is a day I don't get back. And if you know me, I shed tears over it. I lose my mind. Hence the reason why I went beg people to come and please come help us. Please come work. Please come do whatever we need to do to help these kids. So if everybody could keep that in mind whenever it does come time, there are merits to both, but if someone could keep in mind that I could care less about imposing on the adults would be all right. It's the days from right now through the entire next year, which could be a full calendar year, that real changes, they just aren't occurring. Thanks.
Thank you, Dr. Chasson. Ms. Morrison.
When I'm thinking about real hard decisions, I think about the executive team that we have currently, which I do have confidence that could make those types of decisions. I'm kind of leaning towards an interim and having the new board, just like we did, choose the superintendent. The other way, I feel kind of rushed. This way, we'll have more time. We can include, the community could have an input. Because I like the way it happened when we were on. We appointed Mr. Lemoyne, which did a great job. I think there were some decisions that had to be made with his experience and the people around him. Those decisions were made. And then the board, they're knowledgeable enough to, review the candidates and ask questions and make a sound decision. And we didn't feel rushed. And so that's kind of where I'm leaning towards right now. But I have every confidence in the people that we have here currently that can make some tough decisions. A lot of the tough decisions has been made. So moving forward, that's just kind of where I'm leaning towards right now.
Thank you, Ms. Morrison. Dr. Chasson?
Mr. President, just so Ms. Morrison knows that she won't have to feel rushed, an interim would be a much quicker process, and that would be rushed, as opposed to this process to appoint permanent. The ads have to run. We have to intake applications. A national ad has to run. We're taking in more applications. It's a blind P.O. box. And then, so it isn't rushed, there's a mandatory 30-day window that has to properly pass for us to then even consider selecting a permanent person at that point. So, like a quick one would be like 45 days. A typical one is like 60 days. Yeah, and Mr. Hammond's nodding. So, I mean, that's still a 2-month full process of getting input, interviewing candidates. So you don't have to feel rushed even if you are leaning on the fence. It is, or on the fence. It's a very long process, and we're going to have a lot of input, whether we want it or not. We're still going to have a lot of input. So then you're going to feel rushed when you get that input.
Mr. Hidalgo.
Just wanted to point out, Dr. Chasson and Ms. Morrison, that either option, whatever passes, I mean, certainly I, as a board member, am going to do my best to implement with fidelity, but I don't think either process should be rushed. Whether it's interim, we have until May, whether it's, because the superintendent will be here with us till then, or whether it's permanent, neither one have to be rushed, so.
Thank you, Mr. Hidalgo. Mr. Lechley?
Just to kind of touch on what you were saying, Dr. Chasson, by going 2 years and 6 months, we limit the talent we can get to apply. Mr. Hammond's let us know that traditionally, someone from another school system may not move their family here for 2 years and 6 months. So we're limiting the pool of talent that may or may not apply. By going interim and starting the process, as Mr. Hidalgo said, January 2nd, we now open, we have a huge pool to pick from, or the next board has to pick from. So in a way, by going 2 years and 6 months, we're limiting our options and who we can and cannot attract. Now, if I'm a strong leader, would I take a chance on 2 years and 6 months? I may not. Depends on where you are in your life, if you're going to move your family here or not. And as far as an interim, making the tough decisions, if you're a leader, you make those decisions and you stand by them. If you can't make those decisions, then I don't even want you applying. The term of whatever I've ever done in my life has never determined whether I made a tough decision or not. You know, we have 10 months left on our term and are facing re-election. That will never come into play on the decision I make, because our time is short. So what I'm saying, the voters will be deciding our fate October 12th. So I'm a short-termer. So tradition would maybe say, man, I best go sit in the corner and keep my mouth shut for the next 7-8 months so nobody qualifies against me. No. As a leader and a representative of District 5, I'm going to make the decisions I got to make. It may keep me in office or it may take me out of office. But that's what you do when you're a leader. You make that decision. So I think we're just limiting, we're limiting ourselves with the educational talent they have out there. So that's just my 2 cents on that.
I'm going to give each of you one more crack at this, all right? So make it count. No, you raised your hand first. Go ahead.
Mr. President, to respond properly to Mr. Latchley, for me,
You should respond to me.
yeah, Mr. President, to respond properly, it didn't matter how big the pool was whenever we had that superintendent election. I knew we were choosing Dr. Aguilar. I knew it. Didn't matter how big the pool was. Didn't matter if we were given a 10-year contract and we had 10 years to decide. He was a favorite from before. He formally pulled out of that application process. And with him being a favorite from before, he was a going-in favorite. And I knew he was going to get the job. So didn't matter how big that pool was, I knew he was getting it. So doesn't matter how big it is. If you're confident, you're confident. So I agree with you. Kind of, sort of.
While we have the media here, thank you, and we are taking minutes, I do want to state on record, because I'm trying to mitigate what I already know is going to happen on Facebook as soon as this meeting's over with. I am not scared, never have been scared to make tough decisions. This is not about hiding from a tough decision. That is correct, Doc. That is correct. So this is not about hiding from a tough decision. But this is about making the right decision, and we just have a difference of opinion up here clearly on what the right path is. I know that no matter what direction we take, it's going to be a positive direction. But, and I don't think any of you all are scared to make tough decisions. So with that said, can we move on and make a decision?
After the three of you have repeatedly weighed in, I want to offer one more time. Does anyone, that was a very good suggestion from Mr. Mahler to actually have an interview for, to almost treat it like a permanent search if we do go the interim route. where the public may have the opportunity to ask questions and get to know the candidates. And just because I complimented you doesn't mean I want another suggestion, okay? No, I'll seriously open up the floor, because if there's anything that kind of jogged your memory, made you think of something, you might have a suggestion that will help us out or add to the conversation about this, now's the time, because when we move to the next item, there will be motions made to start making these decisions, and at that point in time, you will only be allowed to comment on the motion on the floor. So this is your opportunity to say whatever thoughts you have on your mind regarding any of this stuff that we have talked about tonight. So, Mr. Muller, please.
Going off of talking about leadership, as a resident of District 5, I would encourage you to change your mind, Mr. Latchley, because we do need to just get this over with. Why kick the can down the road? I feel like interim is making the easy decision, and a true leader isn't going to be scared of a 2-year, 6-month contract. They're going to say, I'm going to go in there, I'm going to impress everybody I need to impress, and I'm going to make sure that they hire me back and extend my contract.
Thank you, Mr. Muller. Mr. Newman.
So I like college football, and if I had a son who was thinking about a college football team, and that team had a sort of a challenging record, challenging history, and they had an interim coach, I don't think I'd encourage my son to sign up for that team, even though it might be turned around. We have some schools that are in a more challenging situation. To find the top-notch personnel for those schools, if you don't have a top-notch coach, and he can hire the staff, and the people know that person's going to be around for a while, you're going to have a difficult time getting the best personnel for those schools. So I would encourage us to think about getting a good person, permanent person now. And the kids it's going to affect most are the ones that are in more challenging schools. They're the ones who they need the best principals, the best staff now. The only way you're going to attract those people is with a good superintendent that's here right now. You're not going to get principals to change and move if they don't know what the future is. So I would ask that you consider the kids, especially following our transitions.
Thank you, Mr. Newman. Last call. Ms. Gardner, are you coming up here to say something? Give us the principal's point of view, please.
Apply for the permanent position. What would the board consider in this situation? You'd have to vote on it.
We'd have to vote on it, and I think you would have to have a board member who would want to include that particular language in the motion should we go the interim route.
Okay.
I think the first motion that we're going to take on the next item is whether we want to do an interim, appoint an interim, or do a superintendent search. And then once we make that decision, we kind of go down the decision tree.
Because I think that would be kind of a turning point too, is if, to make that decision, do we move forward of hiring someone like Mr. Knezik and Mrs. Chaplin, which I can see such a great side of, because we've had such great consistency of these 4 years, which is ironic. I was hired at the same year as Dr. Aguilar, so I've only been a principal under one superintendent. Yet at the same time, if we have this rock star if we go that route, and we have this rock star who comes in and has this passion and does such a great job, knowing that we have the possibility to continue with that movement and even less change. So when deciding whether you will go either route, I think that has to come into play before the final decision is whether you go interim or you go the 2.5 years.
Thank you, Ms. Gardner. Mr. Cole.
Good evening, members of the board. Jonathan Cole, president of the Lafayette Parish Association of Educators. Transition is never an easy process, and I don't envy you the decision that you have to make in this particular situation that is before the board. There's a lot of infrastructure in place in our school system, a lot of unique individual characteristics, everything from our academic programs to the facilities to the agreements that we make as an organization with other aspects of our community. So as far as my take, as far as where my perspective is, what I'm interested in hearing is from the current leadership. Dr. Aguilar maybe could give us some aspect as a superintendent coming into this organization. What was his position when he applied here? Was the interim thing that made it less attractive, or a full-time position as a superintendent? And there's very few of us in that room that would qualify for that position. What is it that we look at when we're going to make a decision about landing in Lafayette Parish with the 30,000 kids and the 2,000 employees plus that work with the kids every day? So that's where I am on it. Making an interim decision seems like it's an easy decision at this point to make, given the circumstances, but a long-term decision, a 2-year plus contract would be acceptable as well. I don't think that was much help, but that's just kind of what's been going through my mind. What's Dr. Aguilar, what is your advice for this organization? That's what I would like to hear at this point. Because he's been sitting over there daydreaming all night. I've been watching him,
Feel free to answer or not answer, whatever you choose. Let me distill your question for him. Would the existence of a max 2.5-year contract have given you pause for applying if we were to do a search?
Yes, absolutely. A couple things you have to consider, that a 2.5-year contract offered to a new superintendent, we are 25 days away from accountability testing. So essentially, this year's test scores are in the can that won't be released for 12 months. So that new superintendent will not be accountable for those first-year results. So they will already be a year into that 2-year contract. It takes time to begin to replace personnel. It's not a matter of just firing people and then hiring whomever you would like in those positions. It takes time to be deliberate about making decisions about personnel. We began the process of the budget for the upcoming school year. So that new superintendent will not have played a part in this budget for the next school year. So this is a difficult decision for the board. I can't advise you one way or the other, but I do know that you're going to be thoughtful and you're going to make the best decision for kids.
I would also add to your point, Dr. Aguilar, that potential applicants really don't know who they would be working for come January 1st. So, anyone else? Last call. We have a lot of smart people in this room. Oh, and here comes one of them. Fun fact about Miss Freyu here. Are you Miss Freyu now?
No, not yet.
Not yet. Okay. Miss Bienvenue is she and I graduated from high school together.
Hello, Maggie Bienvenue. I'm a graduate student at UL in educational leadership. I'm also here with LPSB and also with the Council for Exceptional Children in the state. The only question I'm having here is there anything about the permanent process that would not allow us to be able to have an interim if, say, that process is dragging out? So say that you're doing your due diligence and you're going through all the candidates and we're coming close to that May time. Would you still be able to actually appoint somebody temporarily, at least as an interim within? So.
Mr. Hammonds, I'll let you answer the question.
Yes.
She asked if there was anything that would prevent us from doing that, and you answered yes. So what is the thing that would prevent us?
No, actually, you could use an interim if the permanent selection process went beyond May the 17th. The only issue that you would confront would be the issue that I mentioned before, that some boards say that the interim cannot seek the permanent position. That would have to have been clarified in advance. But beyond that, if you don't have the process complete by May 17, you can continue the process until it is complete, and you have to have a superintendent, obviously. So as of May 18, someone would have to be designated as interim superintendent.
As a follow-up question, would we be able to do a search, and then at some point during the search, as the song goes, call the whole thing off and appoint an interim? Say we open our applications, we are not impressed.
Actually,
As some of our fears indicate, we are not impressed with the quality of applicant that we receive for various reasons, and we say, well, we need to get past January 1 and do a traditional search. Is that an option?
yes, that is an option, and I have had that happen where boards have not been impressed with any of the applicants for a permanent position, so they've started over again. And they've advertised again, they've gone through the entire process again, and what's always interested me about that is that you would think that the second go-round, they would get pretty much the same applicants they had the first go-round, and that's never been the case. The second, a lot of the people who apply the first time realize that if they didn't look good enough to the board to warrant going forward with the process, that it was a waste of time for them to reapply, and so they choose not to reapply, and others are prompted to do so. And so I've had it happen a number of times where the board has not been satisfied the first time, gone out a second time, and they found that their second pool of applicants was totally different from the first pool. So that is a possibility.
Okay. Going once, going twice. Anyone else? All right. Item number 3 on the agenda tonight is action with regard to the superintendent search procedures. I will open the floor to any motions that anyone would like to make.
I move.
Mr. Knezik.
I move that the board move forward with hiring a permanent superintendent.
We have a motion from Mr. Knezik and a second from Mr. Broussard that the board move forward with hiring a permanent superintendent. Do we have any public comment on this motion? To be clear, in the absence of a substitute motion, the board will be voting on whether to start a search for a permanent superintendent to be awarded a contract of up to 2 years and 7 months or whatever it is. Do you have any public comment? Do you have any board member comment? Dr. Shassel.
Just another subtle reminder for everyone, if anybody's on the fence.
I'm the only one that hadn't said what they're doing.
I know. Just implore everyone to do what's best now for everyone as opposed to in the future. Like there are an interim person that has to hire a principal or an instructional leader, or for that matter, a teacher. There are 92 teachers in the the graduating class for UL. 50 live in Lafayette Parish. How many of them do we truly get to come and work for us if we appoint an interim? You appoint someone permanently, and you continue the success of everything we have going on, as opposed to we're going to change once and then change twice. So just a little reminder.
I guess we talked about it all already. Madam Secretary, I'll call for the vote.
The president has to be somewhat silent.
4 for, 5 against.
The floor is open to additional motions.
I'd like to make a motion that we hire an interim and then begin the search with the new board. And I feel that the interim could also apply.
That's a very long motion. May I recommend that you cut it off after that first sentence? An interim superintendent will suffice for right now. We do have some additional things to clarify afterwards, so. Thank you, Ms. Morrison. So Ms. Morrison has a motion on the floor to appoint an interim superintendent, seconded by Mr. Lachele. Do we have any public comment?
Since it seems pretty evident that this is the way that the board wants to go with it, does there need to be an amendment to the motion or a substitute motion to add into the fact that you're going to go through the interview process? Or is that going to be hashed out in the details that you said after?
Details after. What we don't want to do is have too many concepts in the same motion, which end up causing the motion to fail because individual people don't like particular aspects of it. So we try to make the motions as simple as possible and then fill in the details afterwards. Any more public comment on this motion? Any board member comment? Madam Secretary, I will call for the vote.
I will too.
Six for, 3 against.
Motion carries. South. So I will just make a suggestion as some of the things that I heard about appointing an interim, that we solicit anyone who is interested in applying to send a letter and a resume to a P.O. box that, if we do not have already, Miss Thibodeau, do you have such a P.O. box that we can use for this? I don't know if you need anything other than me telling you to get one, but okay. Where is our P.O. box located currently? Which post office?
There is no physical box. It gets delivered, the mail gets delivered here.
Oh. What I heard Mr. Hammond say was a P.O. box that the board president has the key to. I would prefer for it to be at the downtown post office, please, if possible. Okay. All right. And this is all, these are suggestions on my part from what I heard to make this process easier. I think also we'd probably be interested in seeing the list of employees that are superintendent certified. Does anyone want to make an additional motion?
Not an additional motion, but if I could add to the recommendations, I would like for the criteria to include not the public as well as any staff member somehow be a part of this process. I know it's going to be open meetings when the decision is made, but I'm talking about throughout the process, if we can find a way to, not if we can, let's find a way to engage them, as well as Ms. Gardner actually did change my mind on something when she was up there speaking. I would like to suggest that we include that whoever the interim turns out to be is not precluded from, being able to apply for the job, just in case it is a.
I think we should specify each of this by board action. The PO box, the interview process, and not being precluded.
Okay.
Just to make sure we're all clear on that. So, would anyone like to make these motions? Ms. Morris.
I'm not going to make the motion, but just to add one more thing, just so that it's perfectly clear that any interim that we hire has the full authority of a superintendent hired after a search.
I believe by state law they do, correct?
I understand by state law, but I want to make sure everyone is clear that an interim is just the same as
I will recognize you at every meeting from here on out and let you say that very thing if you like. All right. Does anyone like to make a motion concerning any of those items that we just discussed?
Yeah. I don't have them listed. Okay,
Leave the key in the HR department, and the vice president and I will go and check the PO box together. Absolutely, I understand.
All right. See if I can get this right.
Still needs to be at the downtown post office.
Okay. I move that a PO box be established at the downtown post office, 70502 zip code, and that the criteria for interim superintendent does not preclude them from applying for the permanent position. And that the interim superintendent shall have the full authority, the same as a permanent superintendent. Hey. We had one more item. Oh, yeah, and that the interview process include and engage staff and members of the public.
We have a motion on the floor that I am not going to repeat, and a second by Mr. Angel. Ms. Blanco, did you get that? Thank you. She says she did. Have any public comment on this motion that we establish a post office box, have an interview process, reiterate that the interim superintendent has full authority of a permanent superintendent, and that they are not precluded from applying in any subsequent permanent superintendent search? Do we have any public comment on that, on any of those options? Dr. Aguilar.
Thank you.
Oh,
So,
public comment.
just a quick question. You're looking for a letter of interest to be mailed to this post office box?
A cover letter and a resume, I think, would be sufficient. And Mr. Latchley and I will compile these letters of interest.
Do you have a deadline in mind for receiving those?
I think this would be something that we can discuss after we vote on this motion.
Thank you.
Thank you for bringing that up. Ms. Morris?
The current motion, does it talk about the qualifications we want for our interim?
It does not.
Do we need to add that in, or
We
is
can
a separate motion?
certainly handle that after we vote on this.
Okay.
I don't think we can handle any additional criteria. Any other board comment?
Who was the second?
Madam Secretary, I will call for the vote.
Dr. Chassel.
Dr. Chassel, do you know how much longer you need?
Nine, for, and then against.
Motion carries. So we are now, at this point in time, appointing an interim superintendent and establishing a post office box. I will, Ms. Thibodeau left the room, did she? Oh, there you are, right there. I was looking in the back where you were. Please keep the keys in your office. Mr. Latchley and I are the only ones to be given a key to that post office box. Do we have any other motions? Do we want to specify any kind of criteria outside of superintendent certification? Do we want to have a motion on the deadline? Mr. Broussard.
Got a question. After appointing this interim and giving the new board the authority to search for one, are we appointing them for a year?
So
from May 17th to May 17th?
So Mr. Hammond suggested earlier that the motion, when we do eventually appoint the interim superintendent, contain language that says subsequent to a successful contract negotiation. So it would be difficult for us to decide that now unless you guys want to actually make a motion and specify a term that we would be looking to negotiate with whoever is appointed.
I'll make a motion. I move that the interim term be 2 years, 6 months.
We have a motion and a second by Dr. Chasson. That the term of the contract for the interim superintendent be 2 years and 6 months. Starting from May 18th, correct?
Yes.
I presume we don't need to discuss this anymore, do we?
2 years?
Board
Well,
members?
I'd like to make a comment.
That's perfectly fine if you'd like to make a
I
comment.
saw some chuckles from the crowd, the same folks who were upset a minute ago that we were hiring an interim, but it's really funny because in this case, much like going through the process of hiring an interim is like an RFP, in this case, we could just skirt by, hire an interim on little to no interviewing, and have him for 2 years and 6 months, so I'm not laughing about that.
Thank you, Mr. Hidalgo. Do we have any other, Mr. Angel?
Would I be in order to make a substitute motion, Mr. President?
I believe you would, if it pertains to the length of contract.
I would make a substitute motion that the interim be hired for 1 year from May 17th. Whatever the expiration is.
We have a substitute motion by Mr. Angel.
I commend my colleague.
Second.
And a second by Mr. Lachele. As an accounting procedure, might I suggest that you go May 18th to June 30th instead of May 18th to May 18th? To the end of the fiscal year.
Sure.
Ms. Blanco, the motion is now from May 18th, 2019 to June 30th, 2020 as a contract term. That is the substitute motion on the floor. Do we have any public comment on this? Now we are discussing a interim superintendent's contract term for essentially the 1920 school year and through the month of June 2020. Ms. Thibodeau.
I just want to ask, would you all like for me to post it on the website?
I think we will get to that. We will answer that question for you in a minute.
Okay.
Ms. Morris?
I'd like to make a motion that the...
No, I'm sorry, we have a substitute motion
Oh,
on
I'm
the floor.
sorry.
We're going to have to vote on that
I'm
first.
moving too fast.
Do we have any other public comment on the substitute motion? Do we have any board member comment on the substitute motion? Mr. Angel?
Yes, I think that we would be better servicing our community and our students if we advertise for a superintendent for a full 4 years, like Mr. Hammond mentioned earlier. That would open up, I think, some additional potential applicants if they knew that if and when they were hired, they would be here for a 4-year period. And I think if it's only for a 2-year period, again, like Mr. Hammond's alluded to from experience, a superintendent would be maybe hesitant to move his or her family to Lafayette from elsewhere, knowing that I'll only be here for 2 years. I think it's incumbent upon us to open it up for 4 years, or the next board, actually, that would give our students an advantage over limiting it to only 2 years.
Ms. Morris?
I'd like to make a motion that the...
We're still on the substitute motion.
Oh, gosh.
I'll let you know when it's time. Don't make me say point of order. Mr. Knezik.
And just for Mr. Hidalgo's sake, he referenced RFPs, and I would argue that requesting cover letters with resumes and then evaluating those applicants is exactly that request for proposal process. So, not to allude that we're not publicly requesting applicants and then going through an evaluation process. Second, I have a question for Mr. Hammonds. If the next board hires a new superintendent, say by March, what happens to the interim? I don't necessarily recall.
Well, it depends on what you want the effective date of the new superintendent to be. You could hire him by March, effective July 1. You could hire him by March and effective earlier than that. Some boards have brought their superintendents in a month before they are officially to take office. They call them consultant or something else, give them another title, but give them an opportunity to have a month with the outgoing superintendent to kind of learn a little bit of the office and the personnel. So you get to select in the permanent process what you want the effective date of the employment to be.
Well, it won't necessarily be me on the next board selecting
Right,
the
and I say you, I
superintendent.
mean the next board.
Could we have a clause in the interim's contract that said your term ends either June 30th, 2020, or at the point of appointment of a new permanent superintendent?
Sure. As a matter of fact, there is no specific term of employment of an interim. And that's actually the reason why some boards like to call them interim, because they can be changed. An interim can be changed with a new interim by vote of a majority of the board at any time.
Thank you.
Unless they have a contract that specifies that they would be employed for a certain date, and then you run into some due process issues.
The motion on the floor with an end date of June 30th, does it restrict the board from adding a clause that would add some sort of early termination if the next board hires a superintendent?
Well, as I interpret the motion that's on the floor, it would. The motion on the floor is that the interim would be hired for a specific period of time from May 18 of 2019 until June 30 of 2020. That would be as I appreciate, that's the substitute motion that's on the floor.
And I would just add for our conversation and potentially modification of the motion that we consider that circumstance where the new board comes in and is eager to hire a new superintendent, hires a new superintendent effective as early as, it sounds like it could be as early as sometime in February or March. Maybe not, but at least there be a provision in this motion to allow there to be a contract provision to allow that early termination.
In your motion or the substitute motion?
Well, it would have to be in, I don't want to make a substitute to.
Thank you, Mr. Kennesi. Is there any other comment from board members on the substitute motion that we extend the contract from May 18th to June 30th? Madam Secretary, I'll call for the vote. Oh, I'm sorry, Dr. Chessel.
Does everybody realize that inevitably what we're doing is the same thing that we argued about previous to these votes, which is you're basically putting a new superintendent in place in whatever month in the year 2020, so that superintendent then carries over into the next board for 2024 with a 4-year contract? We're essentially doing exactly what the people who argued the opposite of what I did. You're essentially doing the exact same thing for the 2024 board. Because that person is going to request a 4-year contract, and at that point, when you're elected in 2023 to start serving in 2024, that superintendent is going to go ahead and carry into those months for the next board.
Correct. 6 months in. So then that next board that is seated in 2024 picks their own superintendent. So it'll work the exact same way.
Okay.
Same way like when we came in. The exact same way.
So everybody realizes that.
Mm-hmm.
I mean,
What? Mr. Hidalgo.
I mean, the only difference that I could see would be, let's just say that it were not were a case where that superintendent were definitely retiring or definitely leaving. That superintendent could stay until the new one comes in and allow the process. But other than that, yes, I realize that that would be the process.
Any other board member comment on the substitute motion? Madam Secretary, I'll call for the vote. And while we wait, Mr. Kennesi, correct me if I'm wrong, Mr. Hammonds, I believe this can be modified upon the motion to appoint an interim superintendent. Subsequent to a successful contract negotiation, we can specify different terms. I would certainly read this, should either of these motions pass, the substitute motion or the original motion, to be the intent of the board to hire someone through either 2 years, 6 months, as you suggested, or 1 year and 1 month, as the substitute motion suggests. We would be able to modify this at a later date upon appointing the interim, correct?
Correct.
By board action.
By board action. If it's not modified, the contract that we will prepare will be for which one of those 2 time periods.
Thank you very much.
5 for, 3 against, 1 abstain.
The motion carries. So at this point in time, we will be appointing an interim superintendent. We are soliciting applications from anyone, Ms. Thibodeau, even on the website, that we're looking for an interim superintendent. Do we have any motion that specifies a cutoff? Oh, let me go ahead. This is your opportunity to make whatever motion it was you've been trying to make. I'm sorry.
Right. I move that the interim superintendent carry the same qualifications as required by state law for any superintendent.
We have a motion by Ms. Morris, a second by Mr. Hidalgo. That was in the prior motion, the criteria for interim oh, no, I'm sorry, it was not. Thank you very much. We have a motion from Ms. Morris and a second by Mr. Hidalgo that if you'll allow me to rephrase, the interim superintendent be state superintendent certified. Is that certified according to state requirements and the Lafayette Parish School System job description? That the interim superintendent be certified, be state certified. You say it, Mr. Hammonds. I had it.
That the interim superintendent be certified to serve as a superintendent of schools in the state of Louisiana in accordance with BESI policy and board policy.
Does board policy encompass our job description?
Correct.
Thank you. Mr. Hidalgo was the second. Okay. Do we have any public comment on this motion? Board member comment? Madam Secretary, I'll call for the vote.
Nine for, none against.
Motion carries. Do we have any additional motions on this topic, such as a cutoff date of when we will? When are we going to check the P.O. box? Mr. Hammonds, do you have any suggestions? 30 days, 45 days?
I would say 30 days would be, that's the usual amount for the advertisement. And the other thing too, Mr. President, you mentioned something about advertised on your website. You did not indicate whether there'd be any other type of advertising that you wanted to utilize.
Thank you. I would also, trying to pull up the calendar on here and remark that March 5th is Mardi Gras, 2 weeks from today. So perhaps we should say we will collect applications on March 22nd, which would be 1 month and 3 days from now. Does anyone have any different ideas?
Mr. Santana, I suggest maybe we set a postmark date of March 20th and then a collection date of April 1st. It's a Monday. April Fool's Day as well.
We certainly make a motion to that effect.
I move that we accept interim resumes and cover letters that are postmarked prior to March 20th, and that the board president and/or vice president collect them on April 1st, allowing over 10 days for the mail to get through.
We have a motion by Mr. Knezik, second by Mr. Broussard, that we accept resumes and cover letters postmarked no later than March 20th to be collected by the board president and vice president on April 1st. Dr. Aguilar, do you have a comment?
Just, you might want to give HR some guidance that salary might be based on it being negotiable and based on credentials.
Does our job description say that right now?
It doesn't address salaries.
Sounds like it's negotiable then. Thank you for the suggestion. Do we have any public comment on the time frame specified in the motion by Mr. Knezik? Do we have any board member comment on this time frame? Madam Secretary, I will call for the vote.
Resumes and cover letters. Four. Dated. Postmark. Okay, close enough.
Who was the second?
Nine for, none against.
Motion passes. At this point, I'm going to ask Mr. Hammonds, are there any I's or T's that we have failed to dot or cross? Excuse me, Mr. Angel.
Two things come to mind. Number one is the advertising. Do you want to advertise anywhere other than your website? That's number one. And number two is that you need to designate someone to review the applications to make sure that the applicants are qualified to serve in the position. Some systems use their own HR staff to do that. Some systems prefer not to use their own HR staff because actually they're reviewing the qualifications of the individual who will ultimately be their boss. So many systems have traded favors back and forth where one system will use the HR person from another system to help in that regard. But at some point you need to give some direction as to who will be responsible for reviewing the applications to make sure that they're qualified for the position. Those are the only two things that come to my mind.
I would certainly entertain any motion to those two.
Do we need a motion for that? Can we just do it internally?
we can, if y'all are, if y'all are comfortable with it. I mean, at this point in time, the president and vice president will be collecting the applications. I'm certainly happy to give you my opinion, as unprofessional as it may be. Whatever you guys are comfortable with. Ms. Thibodeau, do you have a comment to make?
Yes, I do. When they vetted the applications for the superintendent in Acadia Parish, they had asked me to come in the other surrounding districts, and I can reach out to some of my colleagues from other districts to vet the applications if you would like.
Would that be acceptable to everyone on the board? All right. Well, then I will coordinate with you on when to set that up.
Okay.
Thank you, Ms. Thibodeau. Whatever you feel free to discuss it before you make a motion, and then we can discuss it.
I'll make a motion that we advertise on the LPSS online website.
We have a motion by Ms. Morris to advertise on the LPSS online website. Second by Ms. Morrison. Do we have any public comment on this motion? Do we have any board member comment? Madam Secretary, I'll call for the vote.
And just while we're waiting, I wanted to commend the board. You're going to find that the extra time you spent tonight is going to make things go a whole lot more smoothly in this process. And when you get around to making, well, when the board gets around to making the permanent selection, again, it's going to be the same thing. The steps that you address on the front end make it so much easier on the back end. So I'd like to commend the board for taking the extra time tonight to make these decisions.
Thank you, Mr. Hammonds.
9 for, none against.
Motion carries. If there are any other motions that anyone would like to make? Mr. Knezik?
I am not crystal clear on how we're going to make the selection once we get the applicants and note that they're qualified. So
I will
I'd
give you
clarify that.
an idea that sometime after April 1st, I will call a meeting, and we will review the applications. We will, assuming that there are not an abundance of them. If there are, then in our meeting in March, we can certainly make a motion to say how many we want to invite for the interview that we've specified. We have another meeting between now and April 1st, let's say it that way, that we can handle any kind of questions that we may have.
Thank you.
Anyone else? Okay, that being it, meeting's adjourned.